framed by the badge. The CIA agent who turned the tables by J. Carter. The courtroom was silent, charged with anticipation. At the defendant's table, Maya Lawson sat still, her dark brown eyes locked on the two officers across the room. Their smug expressions hadn't faded. Not yet. They thought they had one. But they had no idea who she was. The setup: Maya Lawson was a woman of discipline, intelligence, and deadly precision. As a covert CIA agent, she had spent over a decade dismantling crime syndicates overseas, toppling corrupt officials, and infiltrating terrorist cells. She was a ghost, a shadow in the world of espionage, an enigma even within her own agency. So when officers Daniel Reed and Thomas Slater pulled her over in downtown Chicago, they assumed she was just another black woman driving an expensive car she couldn't possibly afford. "License and registration," Reed had barked, his fingers already twitching over his holster. Maya, calm as ever, complied. She had dealt with real criminals, the kind that made men like Reed and Slater look like school bullies. Still, when Slater pulled a suspicious-looking bag of cocaine from under her seat, she knew exactly what was happening. "That's not mine," she had said, her voice steady. Reed had laughed. "Yeah, they all say that." The next thing she knew, she was handcuffed, shoved into the back of their squad car, and booked under felony drug possession with intent to distribute. Her spotless record didn't matter. Her insistence on innocence didn't matter. The system was rigged. She knew that better than most. But what these officers didn't know was that Maya wasn't just some ordinary woman. She was a CIA field operative trained in counterintelligence, surveillance evasion, and high-stakes deception. And she wasn't about to let them get away with it. The investigation begins the moment Maya was allowed her phone call. She didn't dial a lawyer. She dialed Langley. Within an hour, a quiet but forceful pressure began to squeeze the Chicago PD. Judges received anonymous memos. Prosecutors hesitated to move forward with the case. Detectives who worked with Reed and Slater started whispering among themselves. And then came the internal affairs investigation. Overnight, the officers' lives turned upside down. An unknown source leaked body cam footage, not just from Maya's arrest but from several others before her. The footage showed Reed and Slater planting drugs, coercing false testimonies, and brutalizing civilians without provocation. Chicago's police chief found himself drowning in a scandal, and yet the officers still thought they could win. After all, who would believe Maya? She was just another black woman the system had ensnared. Or so they thought. The trial. Truth unleashed. The day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Civil rights groups, reporters, and everyday citizens sat in tense silence, waiting to see if justice would finally prevail. The prosecution had spent weeks collecting evidence, but the real moment of reckoning came when Maya took the stand. The defense attorney, a man who had made a career out of shielding dirty cops, smirked as he approached. "Miss Lawson, you claim you were framed by my clients, correct?" Maya met his gaze without flinching. "That's correct. And what makes you so certain? Do you have any background in law enforcement?" She tilted her head slightly. "Something like that." The attorney chuckled. "What exactly is your profession, Miss Lawson?" Maya turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit an official clearance document into evidence." The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded. A manila folder was passed to the bench. The judge opened it, scanned the contents, and suddenly stiffened. The smirk on the defense attorney's face disappeared. The judge turned toward the prosecution. "Is this verified?" "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor confirmed. "Miss Lawson is a decorated field officer with the Central Intelligence Agency." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney paled. "Objection, overruled," the judge snapped. "Continue, Agent Lawson." Now it was Maya's turn to smile. She detailed, with chilling clarity, how the officers had profiled her, manipulated evidence, and fabricated charges. She walked the jury through their pattern of misconduct, exposing each previous case that had been dismissed under suspicious circumstances. Then came the final blow, recordings from a classified CIA surveillance operation that had inadvertently captured Reed and Slater discussing their scheme. It was indisputable. They were guilty. The verdict: the jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty, on all counts. As Reed and Slater were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, The very fate they had orchestrated for Maya. She finally allowed herself to breathe. Justice had been served. But for Maya, this was never just about her. It was about the hundreds of innocent people before her, those who weren't CIA agents, those whose voices were silenced before they could ever be heard. As she stepped out into the sunlight, she made herself a promise. She wasn't done yet, because the system still needed to be dismantled, and she knew exactly how to do it. Aftermath. The fallout begins. Maya walked out of the courthouse into a media frenzy. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved toward her. Reporters shouting over one another. Agent Lawson, what's your next move? Do you think this case will lead to wider police reform? Will you take legal action against the department? Maya didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, she pushed through the crowd, her mind already 3 steps ahead. Because this wasn't over. The conviction of officers Reed and Slater was just the beginning. If they had been so brazen in framing her, a CIA agent, then how many others had they victimized? How many others were still rotting in prison, their voices unheard? Unraveling the conspiracy back at her safe house, Maya opened her laptop and began sifting through the files her contacts in internal affairs had quietly passed her. The depth of the corruption was staggering. Reed and Slater weren't just 2 bad cops. They were part of a network, an organized web of officers, prosecutors, and even judges who worked together to manipulate the system for power, money, and control. Innocent people were targeted, arrested, and pressured into plea deals they didn't understand. Drug dealers who cooperated with dirty cops were protected, while rivals were framed. Money and drugs seized from busts conveniently disappeared. Anyone who spoke out, inside or outside the department, was silenced, transferred, or worse. Maya clenched her jaw. This was bigger than she had imagined, and she wasn't about to let it go. The cleanup operation, unlike most people who fought for justice, Maya had an advantage. She wasn't just a civilian. She was CIA, and the agency had its own way of handling things. She placed a call to an old friend at the FBI, then another to a contact at the Department of Justice. Quiet investigations were launched. Whistleblowers were offered protection. Sealed records suddenly found their way into the hands of the right people. Within weeks, more officers were arrested. 2 assistant district attorneys resigned under mysterious circumstances. A judge who had dismissed multiple cases linked to Reed and Slater was exposed for taking bribes. The entire department was imploding from the inside. And Maya? She wasn't done yet. One last move. Late one night, Maya sat across from Police Chief Harold Grayson in a dimly lit diner. The man looked exhausted, his once imposing presence diminished under the weight of scandal. His hands shook slightly as he lifted his coffee. "You've been busy," he said, his voice heavy. Maya leaned forward. "Not as busy as I could be." Grayson exhaled sharply. "What do you want?" "Reform." He scoffed. "You think you can change an entire system overnight?" Maya smirked. "No, but I can burn the rotten parts to the ground." She slid a flash drive across the table. "Names, accounts, transactions, phone calls. If you don't want this city to turn against you completely, you'll start cleaning house. Fire the ones you can. Investigate the ones you can't. And if anyone tries to fight back," she met his gaze, "remind them who I am." Grayson picked up the drive, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he nodded. "Understood." A new dawn. Months later, the effects of Maya's work were undeniable. Dozens of officers were fired or arrested. Multiple cases were reopened, freeing wrongfully convicted individuals. Community activists gained a stronger voice in police oversight. And the city, for the first time in decades, began to change. Maya didn't stay for the applause. She had done what she came to do. But as she packed her bags for her next mission, one thing was clear. Wherever there was injustice, wherever power was abused, she would be watching. And if the corrupt thought they could get away with it, they were dead wrong. A reckoning yet to come. Maya stood on the rooftop of her Chicago safe house, watching the city lights flicker like dying embers. The war wasn't over, but this battle had been won. Her phone buzzed. A secure line. She answered without hesitation. "You made quite the mess," came the familiar voice of Director James Calloway, her superior at the CIA. She smirked. "I cleaned up a mess. There's a difference." There was silence on the other end, then a quiet chuckle. You always did play by your own rules. I play by the truth, she corrected. Calloway sighed. You've drawn a lot of attention. People in high places are nervous. Good. That means I'm doing something right. A pause. Then, in a lower, more serious tone, Calloway said, Be careful, Lawson. You stepped on the wrong toes. The people behind this, they don't go down quietly. Maya's grip on the phone tightened. Let them come. She hung up, staring at the city below. Justice had been served. But somewhere in the shadows, she knew the real power brokers were watching, waiting for their next move. She wasn't afraid, because now they knew her name. And if they came for her, she'd be ready.